Hi, this is Kelly. You're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast Podcast Network. And I am on today with Anat Shenker-Osorio, who is the host of Brave New Words podcast and is a communications expert. So hello, Anat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So there is so much to talk about. But maybe just for our listeners who aren't familiar with you, if you could just give a little bit of background about what you do and how you got started on doing your podcast.
Sure. So I'm a communications consultant, as you said, and more specifically, I'm an empiricist, which means that I try not just to make stuff up, but rather to test my hypotheses and make sure that they hold. So I do experiments into why certain messages resonate and others don't, specifically for issues of human rights and social justice, racial equality. And I work with campaigns all around the world to try to get that messaging right so that we can engage the base and keep their motivation sustained, keep them at what we need them doing, and persuade the middle to our causes. And as far as the podcast, the shortest version of that story is that for many, many years, as a person who conducts research and then gives people advice off of that research, I couldn't help but notice a pattern that I found troubling/frustrating, which was that even when we would do a giant research project and figure out a whole bunch of stuff, that it would be better to message this way than that way and present those findings, I really found that people had a lot of trouble implementing them, that they would revert back to kind of business as usual status quo, even if they didn't mean to. And in some cases, they did mean to, and we can talk about that discrepancy. And so the podcast was really my effort to take lessons learned from campaigns that we've won all around the world and say, actually, there's a method to the madness. There's a pattern. There's a systematic way that we can campaign that works more effectively. And we can learn these lessons and rinse and repeat them.
Is that true for both issue campaigns and individual candidate campaigns? Are there messaging strategies that are somewhat different depending on sort of what your goal is there, or is a lot of it fairly similar?
Yeah, I would say that foundationally it's pretty similar. But of course, a particular candidate has a particular history and a personality. And let's face it, as much as we wouldn't want to, has a way that they look, right? They are a physical vessel in the way that, say, marriage equality doesn't have a physical vessel. You can kind of import onto that any kind of brand identity you want, or as a human being running for office, let's say, for example, Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She has a body, she looks away, she has a voice, she sounds away. And so there are things about candidates that just are different. And the main thing in the United States about candidates that are different is, as I often like to tell my clients, partisanship is a hell of a drug, by which I mean, when we test a message and we say, how do you rate this message, or how do you feel about the following words, people will give it one kind of rating. And the moment that we say the Democratic candidate says, or the Republican candidate says, and we're retesting the identical paragraph, we have not changed a character in that, the rating for it will be entirely different.
So you were just sort of, as you were saying that, talking about the kind of testing. Is something that you do with focus groups, with surveys? Is it a mix of different things? I think, people hear like research and then sort of realize they don't really know what that means to do research on messaging.
Totally. So it's a whole host of things. First, in most of my projects, there'll be what I call an analytic phase, which is where we look at patterns in language, right? All of social science is just pattern recognition, and linguistics is no different. And so we will uncover, for example, and I wrote a book that was specifically about how people reason and come to judgments about the economy. So if you're analyzing language about the economy, it doesn't take long to notice that there's a couple of prevailing metaphors. And one of those metaphors likens the economy to a body. So you can hear that when we say, the economy is unhealthy. We have a quote unquote recovery bill. The economy is on life support. If we're talking about the 2008 recession, we need to resuscitate the patient. But we also have another metaphor in which we talk about the economy being on the right track, on the wrong track. We talk about accelerating job losses. We talk about going in reverse, which is a very different metaphor. So the first bit of work will be analytic. And then when we get into the actual testing, when we've formed hypotheses around, this seems like a good metaphor, this seems like a problematic metaphor, then we want to try to get some numbers around that. So we'll do at first focus groups to delve more deeply into why people are reacting the way they do. We'll do online qualitative boards, which is kind of focus groups, but instead of people meeting in physical space, they're in virtual space. We'll do online dial testing, which lets us measure people's moment-to-moment responses. We'll do task-based testing, where we will prime people with different metaphors and then give them a task to do, like allocate taxes or decide whether or not a municipal budget should be this size or that size. And we'll see whether that one sentence we prime them with alters their judgments.
Do you ever do any sort of testing on how to get my 5-year-old to eat the foods I want him to eat? Is there messaging that would work on that?
You know what? As the mother of a incredibly picky 7-year-old and a very good eating 12-year-old, I wish that I could tell you. I think the answer is wait. That's my answer to you.
All right. You'd probably be a trillionaire if you could figure out that piece.
That's my next job. That's my side hustle. My side hustle is stuffing children.
So I noticed that you mentioned both engaging the base and persuading the middle. And it seems like there is this tension in the Democratic Party right now. Which one we do? Do we try to go for the middle, or we try to engage the base? And you're saying that we can find the right messaging to do both. How does that work?
Yeah. And in fact, I will take it a step farther and say, not only can we find messaging, and not only does our testing show that we have happened upon that messaging, in fact, it's not just a sort of misunderstanding that it's one or the other. You actually do one by doing the other. So what I mean by that is, there's a canard that says, you're just preaching to the choir, right? If we're having messaging that's toward our base, you're just preaching to the choir. Those are the people who already believe in you. And I don't know if this is apocryphal, but supposedly Al Sharpton once said, the choir's where the trouble starts. And what I mean by that is that if the choir, the base, is not singing in harmony, if they are not repeating the message over and over and over again, by definition, the message is not persuasive, because the groups that I work with, and even major, candidates, even if we're talking at the presidential level, we're not in the realm of $5 million Super Bowl ad buys. We have to understand that a message is like a baton that needs to be passed from person to person to person. And so if it gets dropped anywhere along the way, because the base will not carry it, what we find is that it doesn't persuade the middle because the middle doesn't hear it. And so in order to happen upon a message that actually works, you have to begin your study and your understanding from what the base is willing to carry. Because the second thing that we know, besides that if the words don't spread, they don't work, is that we've had a fundamental misunderstanding of how, quote unquote, the middle works. There's a dominant belief among Democratic consultants, and this isn't just true in the U.S. We see this in the Labour Party in Australia. We see it in center and center-left parties in the European Union. We see it with Labour in the UK. So there's this kind of folk idea that the middle wants a moderate solution, that they desire some kind of moderate policy. And in fact, what experimentation shows us is that by definition, these people are non-ideological. They don't actually have a position. So what I mean by that is that when we do experiments with these so-called middle-of-the-road voters, and we say to them, there's a policy up for reform, and there are 3 proposals under consideration: red policy, orange policy, yellow policy. And then we ask a demographically identical group, and we say there are 3 proposals up for consideration: orange policy, yellow policy, green policy. The people in the first grouping, they overwhelmingly favor orange. The people in the second grouping, they overwhelmingly favor yellow. In other words, they favor whatever policy we tell them is in between 2 policies, regardless of what the substance is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So how do we use that then? So how do we, on particular messaging, make sure that we are focusing the message so that the base is engaged and repeating it and thus persuading the middle?
Yeah. So let me give you some real world examples that I assume everyone will be familiar with. So the kind of canonical one that we use a lot is marriage equality. Before the Prop 8 debacle in my home state here in California, where we lost and kind of, did not expect to, there was this wisdom, again, from a sort of more centrist, we need to meet people where they are, we need to happen upon a message that doesn't upset anybody. There was an old way of talking about marriage equality, and in fact, it didn't used to be called that. It used to be called gay marriage. And the advice was that we should talk about rights. We should talk about practical benefits: married filing jointly, hospital visitation, the ability to see your loved one if, God forbid, the worst, something were to happen. And the reason that was the advice pre-Prop 8 is because what the testing showed, unsurprisingly, is that when you actually talked about love and relationships, the hardcore opposition would recoil because you were asking them to think about romance. You were asking them to think about couples holding hands, God forbid, kissing. The horror, right? And so the advice was, let's have this message that doesn't upset anybody, right? That's very practical and very kind of bloodless. And the thing about the base was that they agreed with that message. We defined the base as the people who agree with us attitudinally, but they wouldn't carry the message because no human being has ever stood in line at the grocery store and said, I was just thinking the other day about my joint filer, right? And so what they would carry is love, right? And love makes a family. And so after losing here in California, there was a recognition that this way of kind of having a milquetoast message, which Democrats have tried over and over again. We hear it on abortion. That milquetoast message was safe, legal, rare. On the economy, it was, of course, we should be concerned about the deficit. The way to handle the deficit is to raise revenue. So the base won't repeat that because the base is not made out of robots. And the middle isn't hearing it anyway because the base won't repeat it. And actually, it turns out that all it does for the middle is confuse them and say, the economy is an issue of deficits and you should be worried about deficits. Instead of saying people who work for a living ought to earn a living and the wealthiest few are taking from what the rest of us create and hoarding the spoils. So, that's part of my answer is you actually attend to kind of what your base is going to repeat. And then the rest of the answer is that you recognize that persuadables actually do not occupy this kind of middle ideology. They don't have an ideology. They are susceptible to arguments from both sides. And so once you figure out that sweet spot, that is a message that the base will repeat, that also clicks on with the persuadables and does not have you scoring a goal against yourself because you're actually repeating the opposition's frames, that is where we land. And that's what that's what we were going for and found with the research that we did that's called the race-class narrative.
So does that explain in some ways why Trump was successful in 2016? Because he had these messages that his base would repeat, whether he was doing it purposely or just instinctually or, whatever that explanation might be. it seems like Republicans in general and Trump in particular are very good at sort of boiling down this message to a very simple, repeatable, a meme basically that carries.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a big part of it. So Trump is, for all of his failures and corruption and poor taste and poor judgment and everything else that we can't level at him without swearing, he is a salesperson. He's a salesman. That's his shtick. And he knows that if your ideas are a steaming pile of crap and you are trying to sell people their own destruction, you have to wrap that in some pretty nice paper. Yeah. And there's got to be a lot of bows on that if you're going to get somebody to buy it. Whereas the Democratic establishment and progressives in particular, we feel that, like, because our ideas are good and because we're trying to put forth policies that actually do make people's lives better, we shouldn't have to market them, right? They should sell themselves because it's simply better policy. But that is not actually how brains work. So yes, it's partly that he's a salesperson, and part and parcel of that is that he capitalized, and I use that word intentionally, on a long-running theme and a through line in U.S. politics, which is dog whistling. It is race baiting. What Trump did that Hillary Clinton was unable to do in the 2016 election, and, let's attempt not to relitigate 2016 ever, but is he had an origin story. Mm. He had an explanation for the listener in Pennsylvania or in Wisconsin, where I'm from originally, or in Michigan, or in a host of places, the aggrieved working white class person. He had an explanation that said, you feel like your life isn't going that great. You feel like your kids are not actually going to be better off than you were. You feel like you're hustling and still not making ends meet and can't pay for your health care. He had an explanation for that. He had an origin story. And of course, his origin story is complete and utter bull. It's, the immigrants, that's who's to blame. And it's the people who aren't working hard. And it's the people who are taking from the government. And it's all of those other people, which has been, of course, the explanation offered to the white working class since at least the Southern strategy with Nixon. Hillary Clinton couldn't give us an origin story because the truth of the origin story is that it's Wall Street, and it's an increasingly wealthy, increasingly small, white male few that have basically hoarded all of the spoils. That's the actual origin story for why people are suffering.
So a little bit ago, you mentioned that we don't want to score a goal on ourselves by repeating the frame of the opposition. Can you unpack a little bit at what that means and how we can avoid that trap?
Yeah. So what we find is that, there's many levels at which we do this. So the simplest is just straight negation, where we say Muslims are not terrorists. Mm-hmm. Immigrants are not taking our jobs. This is not a threat to our way of life. This is not going to bankrupt us. Right? So the simplest form is just direct negation, where the research shows us, and, many people have made this point cogently over the years, it, for whatever reason, still does not go away. As soon as, for example, Trump announced the ban on transgender troops, all of a sudden all of the major LGBTQ organizations were putting out on Twitter, trans people are not a burden. Trans people are not a burden, right? This happens every time. It's like a knee jerk. When we make statements like that, what experimentation shows us is that people recall the assertion and they have trouble remembering whether it was true or false. So that's one way we score a goal against ourselves. Another way, a subtler form of negation, is just by being a continuous no and a don't and a stop and a can't, right? So abolish ICE, end deportation, stop family separation, don't do this, don't have that, end that policy. Where I live, there are posters all over the place that say United Against Hate. Posit to you that against hate, pretty freaking low bar.
Yes. So are there candidates right now for president or for anything else that you think are doing a good job, or campaigns that you think are doing a good job in framing these things as a positive and using our own language?
Yeah. at the risk of being obnoxiously self-referential, the whole idea behind Brave New Words, behind my podcast, was to show, not tell, that progressive ideas can indeed do win. And so what we have there is the story of 6 campaigns that won, that got it right on lots of different dimensions: strategy, organizing, messaging, and won. And so I think, for example, the campaign that I highlighted in Minnesota that I helped co-create, called Greater Than Fear, which was a sort of direct rebuttal and rejoinder to Islamophobia, anti-immigrant bias, anti-Black bias. I think that candidates across the board in that state are doing a really, really great job. I think there are campaigns, that have done really beautiful things that maybe are less well known. So, for example, when the state of Texas announced a Arizona-style Show Me Your Papers law, there's an organization in Texas called JOLT that did an event called Quinceañeras at the Capitol, where they brought young women in their sort of full regalia that is part of a custom that comes from Mexico but is celebrated across Texas for when girls turn 15, and actually just showed the beauty of the culture. Because what we find is that when we are a no and a don't and a stop and a can't, and when all we are doing is demonstrating horrors, and, I'm going to say something pretty upsetting and provocative, which is that the research shows us that when we show pictures of immigrants, including children, behind bars, we actually reinforce the opposition narrative that immigrants are animals. So when we share those images out of an understandable desire to make people present to the horrors, we actually are doing ourselves a favor. And I firmly believe that we shouldn't be making people perform their pain for us as a condition of accepting their humanity.
So the big messaging challenge for the Democrats right now, in addition to the presidential campaign, is, of course, impeachment and all of the many things that are going on around that. Do you think that, in general, Democrats are doing a good job at messaging that as such a complicated, nuanced kind of thing that it's hard for me to wrap my brain around how we make it simple? But, what do you think is or is not working in that messaging?
Yeah, so that's a tough one and understandably tough. The main thing about impeachment is that, as with all things, we have to be able to give people a sense of what's out the other side, and a sense that, to borrow kind of what has now become an Elizabeth Warren trademark, the nevertheless she persisted, but to make it communal, it's, we will persist and we will persevere. And out the other side, we will be a stronger union. So I think that what is missing in the messaging is that there's a lot of talk right now, understandably, about the process, the things that need to happen, the investigations, the explorations, that impeachment goes through the House and then it has to be actually ruled upon in the Senate, and it's a complex process and blah, 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 blah. That's a lot of recipes. We got to sell a brownie here, not just a recipe. And what I mean by that is what's out the other side, not if, but when we prevail and when justice is served and when we ensure that every single person elected to represent us governs of, by, and for the people, every one of us, no exception. Because what we find, even in the snap polling that's been done, that's being done constantly, even about something as timely as impeachment, is that where we get ourselves into a lot of danger is people who aren't sure, right? People who are not our base, people who are concerned about this, who have not been kind of a vocal and powerful force, and more power to them, for pushing for these very, very necessary actions. What they need is a sense of it will be okay, there will be calm, there will be a restoration of order. We will not be in constant and ever, threatening chaos. And the danger that we put ourselves in when we are kind of knee-jerk. Can you believe that he said this? Can you believe that he said that? Can you believe that he did this? Is that we just reinforce for people this sense that there are no grown-ups, there are no adults in the room, nobody can make sense or order. It's all he said, she said. It's all playing politics. Someone needs to deliver a message that's like, when we persist and when we persevere and when we prevail, we will restore order and we will once again have a government that honors its people.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's tough, but I find myself often only speaking with people who already agree with me, essentially, and so it's hard to sort of wrap my brain around what resonates with the people outside of my tiny little bubble.
Yeah, I mean, that's normal for everyone.
Yeah.
I live in a bubble as well. I just happen to spend many, 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 many nights of every one of my weeks behind the double mirrors in focus group facilities. And there's a social psychologist named Drew Weston who also does this kind of political work. And one of my favorite things that Drew says is empiricism is the best possible cure for ego. Whatever it is you think about how people think, and whatever genius you think you have about the messages that you've written, watching Americans react to them night after night after night in, Fresno and Poughkeepsie and Kansas City and Des Moines and you name it, and having to be like, who wrote this? That's a piece of crap. It definitely serves you some humility.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we talk about?
I mean, I really think the main thing and the thing that comes through just astoundingly clear in the research, and perhaps in contrast to quote unquote conventional wisdom, is that talking about race, being explicit and overt about what dysfunctional people have foolishly started calling identity politics, is not only the morally right thing to do, it's actually the winning thing to do. And we find that messages that are explicit about race, that actually name race and talk about how race has been used, race and place of origin, has been used as a weapon by the wealthy few to divide us from each other, to shame and blame people based on what they look like, where they come from, what their accent, how long they've been here, that is the means by which they make off with the spoils. And what we find is that attempts to use a colorblind message to just deliver an economic promise, right? Free college, better health care, better wages and working conditions, those kinds of economic promises cannot actually break through unless we attend to what the other side is saying. And what the other side is saying is race baiting. And so a choice by Democrats, by progressives, by the left to remain silent about race doesn't take race out of the conversation, because the right is still going to continue to blather on and on and on about quote unquote illegals or quote unquote inner city crime or quote unquote thugs or quote unquote people who don't believe in our way of life. And the left needs to wake up to that and realize that a message that includes racial justice is not just necessary for our base, it's actually necessary for the middle.
That's really interesting. So I remember right before my older son was born, I read Nurture Shock. So Nurture Shock is a book about, the psychology around children and raising children. And there is a chapter in that about how important it is to talk to kids about race and how you can't just be sort of colorblind and assume that they'll sort of get it, but that you have to explicitly talk about race with kids to raise them to be race conscious. And, it's sort of interesting that we have to sort of apply that to everyone. But it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, if the other side is coming at the door and saying, immigrants are taking your jobs, or we can't have Medicare for all because then, quote unquote, illegals will be coming and crowding our emergency rooms and taking from us. If you think that you're going to somehow have a magical Medicare for all message, and that's going to work when the other side is race baiting left, right, and center day and night, then you're kidding yourself. And what we find is that messages that actually name race explicitly as including everyone, and then narrate the dog whistle, actually explain how the right uses strategic racism in order to divide and distract us, to have us look the other way, and that as long as we're pointing our finger at the brown guy, we won't be pointing our finger at the bad guy, and that it's only coming together across these divisions that have been manufactured in order to distract us and have us act against our self-interest, that the working class, white, black, brown, can actually, get a leg up to survive, let alone thrive.
So if people want to find more from you, where all can they do that?
Well, they can find the podcast itself on all the platforms, Brave New Words. But if you want behind the scenes extra info, the research that was done in each episode, you want to watch the ads that we aired in each campaign, you can do that at bravenewwordspod.com. That's the website. And then I have my own website, and any research that I am allowed to make public, I happily do. And that is asocommunications.com.
All right. Excellent. We'll put links up to those on our website when we post the episode.
Thank you.
Anat, thank you so much for joining me. This is great. I love getting to pick people's brains about how to do things. I think we could all learn a lot of important lessons about how to message better.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.